On the equinox of the 21st of March 2014, Maori Television spent the day filming local researcher, historian and amateur archaeologist Martin Doutré in the field, showing the wealth of remnants of a pre-Maori megalithic civilization that occupied New Zealand for thousands of years before the arrival of the Polynesian Maori. Initially, the request was for Martin to be interviewed in Maori Television's studio against a panel of so-called expert adversaries. Sensing a hatchet job on his credibility, Martin insisted on the interviews being conducted by Native Affairs at the ancient pre-Maori sites, but with his own cameraman present. In a day-long tour commencing before sunrise and finishing after sunset, Maori TV filmed 2 precisely working equinoctial solar observatories and several other anomalous sites that could be proven to predate Maori by potentially thousands of years. He also gave full interviews on the other subject matter requested, namely the false treaty claims on Northland farmer Alan Titford and the Treaty of Waitangi itself. However, in a 2-part documentary, Maori TV has chosen to ignore everything except a few selective statements, as the overall body of evidence provided is counterproductive to their political agenda. What you are about to see is the raw footage of the bulk of the interviews carried out on this day, but were never shown to the public until now.
What academic background have you got to enable you to do this kind of research?
Yeah, well, I've done some sort of university, but I never really went for degrees. I couldn't stand being in classrooms that much. What has been very, very helpful is a background in carpentry. And at the age of 17, I was setting out buildings with a theodolite. I was involved with measurements. And I've always been fascinated by measurements and the history of measurements. And when you go onto a site sort of like this, that's what you really need to know, is you need to know how to survey it. And then with the use of the computer, AutoCAD, and really Google Earth is marvellous what it's provided, the tools it's provided with, very, very good distance and angle sort of tools. You can hover yourself over a site like Avebury Henge, see where the original tall obelisk was, and very accurately measure all the way to all of the outer markers. We've got wonderful tools these days to make these determinations, but also there are the astronomy programs, Redshift, and where you can, if I've got anything complicated to do, I get my son Gene to do the complicated calculus. I just deal mainly in carpentry type mathematics, and that's what the ancient people were dealing in.
What have you learnt from Maori history and Maori stories about the Patupaere here?
Well, Maori basically described their physiology and many of the attributes of, how they carried their children, or how they would get together in big amphitheatres, how they would talk very loudly and sing, and they loved to play the putarino flute. When they were vanquished in latter years, quite often Maori women were surprised by them up in the bush. They were hiding out for many, many years, in fear of their lives. But at a much earlier period, in Maori oral tradition, it says that Maori, when they first arrived here, had to live in sufferance under the mana of the Patupaere. So there was a long period of time of interrelating. Maori oral tradition tells us that the Patupaere taught them making of nets, a lot of things to do with fishing by the moon or whatever, all of these sort of things. And the turihu taught them line dancing. Also the aspects of tattooing, facial tattooing. So these are all things that were learnt from the earlier people until that era of hostility that followed, yeah.
And what was said about the physical descriptions?
Okay, those people universally across New Zealand, there were different groups here, but they were described as being urukehu and kiripufero, which meant that they had the very light-coloured red or golden tinge to their hair, and they had the pinkish reddish hue to their skin. And they were described as having green eyes, blue eyes, black eyes, all of the normal hues of eye coloration that one would associate with European people. And also the burial caves had many of their skeletons in them for many years. A lot of those burial caves have now been cleaned out, but the people in them didn't have the Polynesian rocker jaw, which has a continuous curve on the lower border. It has an upward indentation, these jaws. Yeah.
You've called your book Celtic New Zealand. Are we to take from that then that you think these people were of Celtic origin?
Not really, no. The Celts are really technically too late a group. They came into being, if you like, somewhere around about 1000 BC, but they were an amalgamation of many groups that came together to form the Celts by about that time. They may go back a little bit before that. But British historians will quite often, when they're trying to refer to these people, use an umbrella term of proto-Celt or pre-Celt. And when I was trying to write about the Urukehu and Kiripufero people of New Zealand, I had a real dilemma. Well, what do you call them? So I just want to use an umbrella term so people could kind of get a bit of an idea of the physiology of these people. Technically, they were probably Fomorians or Tuatha De Danann or the Furbolg people. But, if you said any of those terms, who would understand you? But when you give them an umbrella term like Proto-Celt or Pre-Celt, then people get an inkling about who you're talking about. Yeah.
What about the historical stuff like, some of the things that you've shown us on the rocks and, geological, stuff to do with soil and sediments and what have you?
Yeah. When it comes to symbolism, or cultural symbolism, you do comparative analysis, like if you see the double spiral, well, where have I seen that before? If you see the chevron patterns, where have I seen that before? If you see the lozenge within the lozenge within the lozenge, where have I seen that before? And you start looking through cultures, using the internet and books and everything, until you find comparable cultural expressions or motifs and pictograms elsewhere. Cross-hatching, bullhorns, cupstones, all of these things. And then you start to get a picture of who has been here. Yeah.
A lot of your methodology has been ridiculed by established, academics. What's been the dialogue between you both?
Well, I've invited them. I've put out a invitation. Come with me for just one day, and I'll show you a bunch of anomalies that you're going to have to explain. They'll never front up. It's a very, very taboo subject, and if an academic, an archaeologist wants to commit career suicide, they'll talk about the stuff. But most of them are survivors, so they'll never touch it with a 40-foot pole.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, they're just scared of losing their jobs. But if you took a lot of these New Zealand sites and were able to transfer them directly to Britain, the archaeologists over there would just walk onto the sites and say, yep, par for the course, normal, yep. They'd understand what they were, but we're told they're not here, so we're not expected to find them here, and people are deliberately blind as to their existence, won't go near the stuff.